Gamers should have confidence in the right to access the games that they have paid to play.
That is a statement that just came from none other than the UK government. It was said out loud in Parliament, which is kinda crazy. So let me explain what's happened. Members of Parliament debated stop killing games this week. They spoke for players and industry in equal measure, and suffice to say, their initial response had not been great. But this was their chance to get something real on the record, especially after the much bigger passage of the EU Citizens Initiative. But what nobody expected was for them to be this engaged with gaming discourse. We heard about Concord, about lawbreakers, and even the Kaizo Mario world levels of the Grand Poo World Trilogy. Yes, these things were talked about in Parliament, but I think what matters the most is what they said about consumer protections, and that means today we have a major update and a lot to talk about. Now, you may remember those AI regulation battles we've been tracking on the channel. Well, when tech is meeting copyright law and all the different outlets are spinning these stories differently, it can be a nightmare where you can only be seeing part of the story. And that's where Ground News comes in. They're today's sponsor, they're awesome, and take a look at this. It's Udio settlement with Universal Music. We see that 57 sources covered it, but only 12% right-leaning coverage. So you're missing how this plays politically, and if you are more biased towards right-leaning sources, you're probably going to miss the story entirely. And the headline split reveals everything. Breitbart, who are right-leaning with mixed factuality, announces Universal Music and AI song generator Udio settle lawsuit, announce partnership, which is quite the contrast to AP News, who are rated very high factuality and lead with the impact, saying AI song generator Udio offers brief window for downloads after Universal settlement upsets users. So you can see the difference there. One of them is just talking about a partnership, but the other one is upset users following a settlement. So same story, but different focuses. And this is exactly why I check Ground News daily and I use it as my own newsfeed. You get the factuality ratings from 3 independent agencies. You get to see the political bias, the ownership structures of the news organizations, and the factuality ratings from 3 independent agencies. And that means you're not seeing spin. You're actually getting a reliable view of the news. And beyond their regional homepages, you can set up the likes of, say, their tech page that will go and capture everything from the copyright battles to the regulation threats, all with bias context. So just go to ground.news/Bellular. That's where you'll get 40% off unlimited access with the Vantage plan. That is the best deal you'll get, and that is the plan that I use. Quick recapping things. The UK petition wants to, quote, prohibit publishers irrevocably disabling video games they have already sold. The argument here is clear. Some games have design elements that render them non-functional at a time that the publisher controls. However, no shutdown date has been provided at the time of sale, and that's the critical issue here. The petitioners call this planned obsolescence, and they tie it directly to right to repair and consumer ownership of products, which of course means it's going to be touching on a whole bunch of legislation. Now, this actually went real well. Just shy of 190,000 UK citizens signed the petition. Now that happened over 6 months, and there was a massive spike alongside the EU Citizens Initiative this summer. That's almost double the 100,000 target that mandates Parliament to debate the issue. Now, they had already responded at 10,000 signatures, and their response acknowledged concerns, but it planned no change. It was very much a, we confirm a receipt of your message. Yes. Really toothless. But the real thrust of that response was the government believing that existing consumer laws should apply to the problem and therefore no action would be needed. But with the 100k threshold crossed, they would now have to answer in Parliament, and that meant that MPs could articulate the issue more clearly and actually deal with the nuance. And rather shockingly, that's actually worked. On November 3rd, 2025, Parliament held the debate. Now, for our American audience, you may think of England Parliament and think of the famous chamber with the green benches. This did not happen in that room. These debates usually happen in smaller offices throughout the building with relatively few MPs attending. Now, the format is fairly straightforward. You have MPs speaking on behalf of the constituents who contact them about the petition, and that includes regular people and impacted shareholders like, say, industry bodies. Now, the debate ends with a UK government representative responding to all of the points raised. That's ultimately the format, and ordinarily no legislative action would follow. Sometimes particularly resonant public issues managed to break through, but video games hadn't quite met that bar for a long time. But what was particularly notable about this debate really when we watched it as well, was how the MPs were genuinely engaged, and actually engaged on a very personal level with the substance of the debate. Seriously, no one expected this level of engagement. Petition committee member Ben Goldsborough talked about the Kaizo Mario World stuff.
Now, I'll be the first to admit I cannot play Super Mario World Kaizo for toffee. Those levels are punishing, but I do enjoy watching streamers like Barbarous King, both in creating, and this is the first time Hansard's going to have to write this down, the Grand Poo World trilogy, and playing it live.
Yeah, that actually happened, and it's very weird in a world where what we usually expect is for the MPs to just have some scripts written by their aides. But no, we've apparently got many gamers, many genuine ones.
But on the issue of obsolescence, many people create private servers and play the games on these private servers. I myself am a big fan of Assassin's Creed, where many of the versions have been made obsolete by Ubisoft.
Another one plays Victoria 2.
Even today, when I get the odd quiet evening, you'll still catch me planning new trade networks on Victoria 2, optimising traffic flow in cities' skylines.
And one MP's office had even engaged with Ross Scott of Accursed Farms. Quite wild.
Now, my office has corresponded with Ross, and I'm very grateful for the information he gave me ahead of the debate. He really is a champion of these issues.
And what we witnessed was this group, directed by their own interests and constituents, basically raising every point I think you guys would want to be considered in something like this. Things like, what even is it to own a video game? That actually came up quite early. They touched on some complex things as well, like private support for console games versus PC games, the locking of consoles by manufacturers after privacy detection. They argued that games with online functionality should have continuation methods past the end of service, and that at minimum there should be clear standards for notice periods and refunds.
A recent example is Concord, a game released for PlayStation 5 and Windows in August 2024. Following a disappointing launch, Sony Interactive Entertainment made a commercial decision to shut it down. To their credit, they did refund all purchases, but this is not always the case. I know the honourable members will agree that where publishers fail to make the lifespan of a game clear at the point of sale, they must be held accountable.
They also mentioned some newly updated UK legislation requiring longevity explanations at purchase. Now, that was originally targeted at stuff like Ticketmaster sales, though obviously it's actually kind of relevant to how a lot of games are actually ran. And they even went into the gritty detail. Questions arose around, say, liability for online shutdowns whenever a company folds or a company gets acquired, and what that actually means for a consumer. But the strongest and the most repeated argument was that consumer protections must now be strengthened. And they must be strengthened before the bad practices become fully entrenched.
So I would ask the Minister to review statutory protections in digital ownership and protect gamers in Colchester and elsewhere. Thank you.
Does the honourable member agree that government should ensure existing consumer protections keep pace with these changes so that people are not left out of pocket when digital services they rely on are switched off, often without warning?
That is what you love to hear, and the government's response engaged with pretty much everything. But with that being said, it might not exactly be what you'd want to hear. The government response covered substantial ground. After the usual pomp about revenue per year and player numbers, they went on to clearly state their position on a number of factors here. Basically, now that they've taken a stance on these things, action can actually be taken to perhaps change things. Let's go through them. They made their position fairly clear in preservation.
We welcome ongoing discussions between the industry, national museums, libraries and archives on developing standards for game preservation. And we encourage video game developers and publishers to continue considering preservation efforts when developing, releasing and supporting their games.
Not exactly great news for some supporters. They're also not going to mandate end-of-life support, despite that, of course, being exactly what most campaigners were asking for. They basically see that as stepping into the creative process, where they could essentially end up creating a lot of additional work for the smallest developers in a disproportionate way.
Whilst we do not think that mandating end-of-life plans for video games is proportionate or enforceable, we recognise the concerns of gamers about whether information on what they are purchasing is always sufficiently clear.
Now, that overarching take has been a common theme in most of our legislative coverage for this year, where there's a lot of pointing to financial, reputational, and regulatory risks, and the idea that ultimately it could just hurt competition. Now, here's a specific example of this kind of thing being applied. The Online Safety Act requires companies to protect users and moderate servers on products they operate. So, if they cede server responsibility to the public, do they also cede responsibility for Online Security Act compliance? That's the kind of question that we end up dealing with here when it's actually all getting into the law. Where ultimately the line we tend to see be taken is just protecting the consumer by just ensuring that they actually have information before they make a purchase. For more examples, they note that even in the CD and cartridge era, you had a license to play, not ownership, and that is not changing.
A number of members have made points around ownership, and I think it is important to note that games have always been licensed to consumers rather than sold outright. In the 1980s, tearing the wrapping on a box to a games cartridge was the way in which gamers agreed to licensing terms. Today, this happens when we clicked accept when buying a game on a digital storefront.
But where I think we have seen progress is them acknowledging games playable offline being different from games which are just killed whenever servers switch off. And that is some major progress. Now, they say they're not going to ban companies from making online-only games because they say that's a, quote, legitimate practice. But even while that is the case, they are not going to stand for consumers feeling cheated. Quote, "It is essential that consumers understand what they are paying for." And this is where the existing law does actually still matter here. And that's because even when games fail or are pulled from sale, the companies actually still do have obligations towards customers. So, here's what changes. There will be no new legislation from this petition, but they have engaged with the Chartered Trading Standards Institute. Now, they're an important bunch because they provide operational guidance on consumer law, and they're now developing clear standards for game sales. That would mean that any potential customer would be absolutely clear on what they were buying, and I suppose importantly, on what they are not buying. And of course, what their rights would be if what they've been sold ends up not being delivered. Now, this is a small change compared to new legislative action, but it is actually a new arrow in your arsenal for dealing with these problems. And that does mean it is serious progress. Here's the key takeaway. It all comes down to the petition-specific wording. There is a clause that says, with no date provided at sale. And that clause is why this is getting considered as anti-consumer practice. And that's why the UK government is comfortable sending this to consumer rights bodies to manage. At least for now. Because if it's clear at point of sale that games require external servers to function, then consumers can make informed choices. And in a perfect world, this would hold developers and publishers to clear standards. Standards that can be challenged by consumers who feel shortchanged, which is important. So it is not new legislation. It is not a sweeping EU review that's going to engage with all parties and truly change everything, but it will be enforceable when it comes through. And that actually matters. It means that companies that fail to appropriately protect their consumers could be held accountable. So, to the 189,877 people who signed that petition, great job. It's not the biggest win in the universe, but it is a win. You actually did have an impact. And who knows, as the months and years roll on, perhaps what's happened here today will be key in some legal challenge against some publisher that could actually start to change things. So well done to you guys. Do you know what? After a big, chunky, detailed agent story like this, I think we could all do with a bit of a palate cleanser. And for that, you should check out what's going on with Arc Raiders in this video next.